Hello, I am Furion, I am your host, and today I'd like to talk about how to build a competitive list for a game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. I assume that you have already built at least several rosters and you know the rules of army composition. This episode will reveal the tactical depths of creating an army. If you are a beginner and you're trying to make your first Warhammer Fantasy army list, then you'll find this video more confusing than explanatory. I recommend simply asking one of your friends to do a list for you, and once you play a few battles, you'll get a notion of what this game is about and how a list design can influence the game. So first of all, when we try to build a list, we have to know what is our goal. There is a difference in approach in list building depending on what is the list aimed at. You will build a different list for a solo tournament and a different list for a team tournament. Do you aim at having balanced chances versus every army, or do you want to side your list against a specific opponent? These kind of questions need to be answered before we begin building our list. In this episode, I will focus on how to build a list destined for a solo tournament, a so-called all-rounder, a list that can fight with every opponent. Before we begin to create our roster, we have to know what parts are available for roster building. This means that you have to know what units and items are in your army book and how do they work. In each army there are strong and weak units. Within those units there are also strong and weak combos, and these combos may occur between any kind of unit. It is a common misconception that a strong army is a one that consists of strong units. A strong army is the one that has strong combos, which are called synergies. The concept of diminishing returns in short means that more of the same good unit doesn't exactly mean better. The easiest way to understand it is to imagine list building in regard to magic. Having a mage in opposition to having none is a huge difference. Being able to cast a spell or two is a significant difference as opposed to not being able to spell cast at all. The second caster in most cases also brings much to the party. He can choose a different law, he can carry another arcane item. But how much would a fifth caster bring to your roster? Of course, there are some banishment builds when taking fifth caster can be justified, but in general this is not a good idea. While most players easily understand why bringing many wizards is not good, they struggle in identifying when they have enough of certain unit. Remember that there are no exceptions to this rule. The difference may be in a threshold at which next unit brings significantly less to the party than the others. Also, please bear in mind that the diminishing returns can occur not only if you take the same unit multiple times, but also when you take one but huge unit. It is worth to know that the diminishing returns principle works both ways. If you don't take certain type of unit, then you most likely don't make your army list as strong as possible. This is a very complicated topic and should be analyzed separately for all the armies, but to keep this video digestible, I'll just give you some straightforward examples. Not taking any shrieks in your Vampire Count's army is a mistake. If you don't have one, then you don't impose any threat on your opponent in that phase of the game, which doesn't limit the options of your opponents in movement phase. Same would go for cannons in the Empire army. Having at least one cannon or at least one banshee makes a unique threat to your opponent army, which in turn funnels your opponent into certain responses. And if you are able to push your opponent into suboptimal movement decisions, then you're pretty much on your way to victory. So if you would like to make a good roster, I'd like to recommend you a method that is widely used in competitive games of all sorts, be it Dota, StarCraft, Magic the Gathering, Warhammer, or other various computer and board games. Let's call this method CTD puzzle, which will be an abbreviation of connect the dots with matching puzzle pieces. So in CTD puzzle, the point is to choose a very limited number of core elements and then supplement those core elements with support units of different kind, which will complement the core elements to make an army. Please note that I am referring to term I've just forged, core elements, not core units. For Warhammer, I recommend picking exactly 3 core elements that you would like to build a roster around. Now let's put some flesh on those bones. Let's say I play Empire and I want to make a list, and the cores that I've identified would be a steam tank, a unit of demigryphs, and a Grandmaster with a Runefang. That's it. This is the first step in making your army list. Design your core elements and build around it. For Lizardmen, let's say I want to have a unit of Reaperdactyls, a unit of Salamanders, and at least 3 Scar Veterans on Cold Ones. For High Elves, I can choose a level 4 caster with Book of Hoeth, a Frost Phoenix, and a big block of Phoenix God. With those examples, I hope that I've managed to show you the idea of what choosing your core elements is. Remember that the idea of this method is that the core elements need to present some kind of importance. There's very little point in building your roster around fast cavalry or harpies. Now that you have chosen your 3 core elements, we can begin the process of list building. In general, the filler to your core elements is the answer to the following question. What can I fill my army with, which will compensate for weaknesses of my core elements, and what elements will link my army together, so it can act as a whole? So as Sun Tzu said in his book The Art of War, let's assume we have 3 classes of horses. The best horses, the medium horses, and the worst horses. And so does your opponent. What you want to achieve is to have a fight when your best horses fight against medium horses, your medium horses fight against weakest horses, and your weakest horses fight against strongest horses. This idea has its applications in lots of areas, and Warhammer is one of them. What it means is that you want to have favorable engagements during the course of the game, and if some fight would be too costly to win, then simply sacrifice a unit to avoid engagement. What it means in list design is that you have to have units who are able to do the specific task to outmaneuver your opponent, to put you at the advantage, and to kill your opponent. So now, after you have your core elements and you know what kind of connections you need to do, it's time to connect the dots. This is, as most things in Warhammer, easier said than done. So let me give you some hints on what elements are needed to have a successful all-rounder army. Decide if you want to have a combat block that can win in straightforward combat. If yes, then pick units that will allow you to get into the combat that you want. If no, then pick a combination of units that will allow you to not lose versus straightforward combat block. Decide how are you going to outmaneuver your opponent. In this sense, I mean any possible unit that will allow you to get a favorable position on the battlefield. In this sense, the earlier mentioned cannons and banshees can allow you to outmaneuver your opponent because they'll constrict his movement phase. Other units that will allow you to outmaneuver your opponent would be a low strength shooting like bows or crossbows, fast cavalry, or even a level 1 mage with a lot of fire and fireball. Having an advantage in movement comes from various sources, and it is important to balance out the number of points that you are investing in having control over a movement phase and number of points destined for straightforward killing. If you have something to say in every phase of the game, then you're probably doing it right. Decide how will you survive long enough to keep the battle going in your favor. If you are afraid of playing with a death magic, then you should evaluate how deep in the battlefield your characters have to be. If you are able to put your characters behind your main units and still benefit from it, then maybe that's the way to go. To have some fast heavy hitting unit in the front so it can pose threat to enemy deathcasters. Or maybe you'll decide that you can have a magic resistance on your magic characters. Same logic goes behind defending your units. If you need to defend them from war machines, then take units that are able to deal with the war machines, or will at least gather more attention. If you think that metal magic poses a threat to your unit, then maybe you should take a Scepter of Stability on top of your Dispel Scroll. Identifying what is a threat to your army, and then taking appropriate units, items, and combination of above in order to survive long enough while you deliver the blow is a direction you should follow. Once we have all the puzzles in place, now is the time to worry about small details, as should I have 15 archers and 5 knights, or 10 archers and 7 knights? These changes are of lesser importance than the concept of the roster as a whole, so only dabble in such details while you have your roster core elements and connections ready. Finally, when you have made all the connections, it's time to re-evaluate the roster. Make some theory hammering on how well would this roster fare versus the list that you expect to play against. I recommend doing a list of pairings and fill it up with numbers ranging from -2 to 2, with 0 being neutral, 1 being a little favorable, 2 being greatly favorable, and negative numbers expressing the reverse. What you should aim when making an all-rounder roster is to have as few negative numbers as possible. Having many 2s and many -2s will result in an unstable roster, which performance will be greatly dependent on pairings, and you generally don't want that. Once you are happy with the roster, it's time to test it. Now, this is where the most players make plenty of mistakes. Each roster needs to be tested multiple times. I'm talking about at least 10, 15 games before you can truly say that it sucks or rocks. It is important not to jump into hasty conclusions. Throwing the whole idea of the roster to a trash and building a new one is most likely not the proper way to go. In other words, try to avoid big changes from battle to battle. Stick to a unit or solution for 2-3 battles before changing it. Perhaps then, with more data, you will be able to have a clearer picture when deciding if something is weak or not. Remember that if you would like to improve your roster, then try to make as smallest possible fix. Turning your roster upside down makes comparing results between your performances hard because you have no common ground. I wish you good luck with creating your roster. Feel free to rate the video and leave a comment below. Cheers!